Showing kindness is one of the attributes of God that he declared to Moses when he put Moses in the cleft of the rock and declared his name. Kindness is also an attribute that we should aspire to demonstrate to others. These two chapters in 2 Samuel relate two instances when David demonstrated kindness to others. These two events, like the vignettes in the final chapters of the book of Judges, probably occurred out of chronological order, as David was solidifying his hold on Israel and subduing the nations around them. The first act of kindness which has a good outcome is to Jonathan's son Mephibosheth. The other act of kindness is towards the son of the Ammonite king, who had been kind to David while he was in exile. This act of kindness was misunderstood and led to war. What do these two contrasting acts of kindness reveal about God and David? What should we expect when we do acts of kindness? I'm Brenda Cathcart, and this is the Promise of Rest. During the time that David established his house in Jerusalem, fought and defeated the enemies of Israel, and set up his government, he also took care of two personal matters. The first was upholding his covenant oath to Jonathan to treat his descendants with kindness. When David and Jonathan first met, they immediately made a covenant with each other. 1 Samuel 18:1 says that their souls were knit together. Later, when Saul is seeking to kill David, David goes to Jonathan for assistance. In 1 Samuel 20, verse 8, David asks Jonathan to deal kindly with him based on that covenant. When Jonathan assisted David in escaping from Saul, Jonathan asked David to show that same quality of kindness to his descendants. 1 Samuel 20, 14 through 17. And you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, Let the Lord require it at the hand of David's enemies. Now Jonathan again caused David to vow, because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. The word kindness in this passage is the Hebrew word chesed, numbered 2617 in Strong's Concordance. It means to show kindness, favor, good deeds, mercy, loving kindness, and pity towards others. However, this definition does not show all the nuances of this important word. The Theological Word Book of the Old Testament has over 2 pages of commentary on the use of the word chesed. It includes references to several doctoral theses written on the biblical meaning of this word. The debate centers on whether showing kindness is a matter of free choice or covenant loyalty. The first use of a word in the Bible frequently sheds light on the contextual meaning of the word. The first use of chesed is when Lot acknowledges that God showed loving kindness to him when God rescued him from Sodom. Genesis 19:19. Now behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have magnified your loving kindness, which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, for the disaster will overtake me, and I will die. On what basis did God show loving kindness to Lot? Was it because of God's covenant or promise to Abraham, or because God freely chose to rescue Lot apart from his covenant with Abraham? As so much in the Bible does, it all comes down to motive. God's covenant with Abraham is motivated by his love for Abraham. Based on that love, God freely chose to show kindness to Lot. Another example is the kindness that Ruth shows to Naomi. Yes, Ruth was married to Naomi's son, which formed a covenant relationship. However, Ruth freely chose to follow Naomi because she loved her. So, chesed has elements of both commitment to a relationship and freely choosing to act with kindness. The Theological Word Book of the Old Testament concludes their discussion with these words. It is a kind of love, including mercy, hanan, when the object is in a pitiable state. It often takes verbs of action, do, keep, and so refers to acts of love as well as to the attribute. The word loving kindness of the KJV is archaic, but not far from the fullness of the word. David was in a pitiable situation when he needed rescue from Saul. Jonathan anticipated his descendants being in a similar situation after his own death and when David ascended the throne. Each man freely chose to show kindness based on their love for the other. So now that David had ascended to the throne, David inquired whether any sons of not only Jonathan, but of Saul lived, so he could show them kindness. 2 Samuel 9:1. Now David said, "Is there still anyone who is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" David decided that he would show kindness to any of the descendants of Saul, not just to Jonathan's offspring. He asked Ziba, a former servant of Saul, if he knew of any descendants of Saul who were still alive. The only descendant that Ziba knew of was Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, who was living in the household of Machir in the town of Lo-debar, east of the Jordan River. Apparently all the members of Saul's family fled when Saul was killed. However, 2 Samuel 4:4 tells us that Mephibosheth's nurse fled with him, and he was injured as they fled. Mephibosheth was taken into the household of his uncle Ishbosheth in Mahanaim until Ishbosheth was murdered. When David located Mephibosheth, he had Mephibosheth brought to him in Jerusalem. I imagine that Mephibosheth thought that David would execute him, since he was the only remaining descendant of Saul. When Mephibosheth was brought into David's presence, he fell on his face before David. 2 Samuel 9:6 and 7. Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he said, "Here is your servant." David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table regularly." Far from wanting to kill Mephibosheth, David wanted to show kindness to him. This is the word chesed again. Mephibosheth had been living in the household of Machir. He didn't seem to have any resources of his own. David declared that he would restore or return Saul's lands to Mephibosheth. The question is, how did David have the means or authority to give Saul's lands to Mephibosheth? There are several possible ways this could have happened. The sage Radak promotes the view that David, as king, was entitled to the lands belonging to Saul because of the rebellion of the house of Saul headed by Ishbosheth. A second possibility proposed by Matthew Poole is that David's wife Michal was the closest known descendant of Saul, and she inherited through the provisions in Numbers 27:8. This would have put the lands in David's control. A third possibility, proposed by Keel and Dalish, is that distant relatives of Saul had taken possession of the land, and now that a closer relative had been found, David decreed that the land should be returned to Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth responded with words of gratitude that David would regard such a lowly man as himself. Mephibosheth compared himself to a dead dog. 2 Samuel 9:8. Then he bowed himself and said, "What is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I?" It is interesting that in 1 Samuel 24:14, David stated that Saul treated and pursued him like one would a flea or a dead dog. The NKJV Study Bible comments on the way dogs were viewed in ancient Israel. Dogs in Israel were regarded as unclean scavengers and were generally viewed with contempt. See 2 Kings 9:34-37 and Proverbs 26:11. Saul continued to treat David like a dead dog and continued to try to kill him. David, on the other hand, lifted Mephibosheth up and brought him into his house as a son, seating him at his own table. 2 Samuel 9:11b. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons. Since Mephibosheth was lame and would be living with David, David appointed Ziba to be the administrator of Mephibosheth's lands. 2 Samuel 9:9 and 10. And the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and to all his house. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem and ate at David's table as a son, while Ziba and his sons worked the land for Mephibosheth. David's second act of kindness, or chesed, was towards the new Ammonite king. 2 Samuel chapter 8 records that David fought and defeated the Ammonites, so his act of kindness must have been before the war began. In fact, it seems to have been the event that started the war. Apparently, David had received aid or kindness from King Nahash of Ammon when he was hiding from Saul. The Ammonites were descended from Lot. In Deuteronomy 2:19, God had told Moses that Israel was not to harass or meddle with the people of Ammon. In Deuteronomy 23:6, God told them to keep their distance from Ammon. They were not to help Ammon prosper. However, the Ammonites didn't keep their distance from Israel. They had repeatedly attacked Israel and had made themselves the enemy of Israel, with the exception of giving aid to David. Now, when David heard that King Nahash had died, David saw an opportunity to respond with kindness to the king's son and make peace with Ammon, or at least not to be enemies with Ammon. He sent condolences to Nahash's son Hanun. 2 Samuel 10:2. Then David said, I will show kindness to Hanun, the son of Nahash, as his father has showed kindness to me. So David sent by the hand of his servants to comfort him concerning his father. And David's servants came into the land of the people of Ammon. Did David violate the terms of the covenant with God by attempting to make peace with Ammon? The Art Scroll commentary on 2 Samuel discusses the difference between showing an act of kindness to an individual versus a nation. The prohibition may apply only to the nation of Ammon, but not to individual people. Even so, David should have realized that the Torah does not approve of friendly approaches to Ammonites. The book of Proverbs gives us another way to look at this situation. Proverbs 25:21 and 22. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he is thirsty, give him water to drink, for so you will heap coals of fire on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Paul quotes these verses in Romans 12:20 and 21, concluding that repaying goodness for evil overcomes evil. So David's intended act of kindness towards Hanun could be seen as his attempt to overcome the evil actions of Ammon with good. The princes of Ammon advised Hanun that David couldn't possibly be sending representatives as condolences for the death of the king. They must certainly be spies to learn about the ways to take the city. Hanun, of course, believed the princes and humiliated David's servants. 2 Samuel 10:4. Therefore Hanun took David's servants, shaved off half their beards, cut off their garments in the middle at their buttocks, and sent them away. The children of Israel were not to shave their beards, thus shaving off the rest of the beard would not be an option. Therefore this state of being half shorn would last for months. Shaving off half the beard could be seen as an even greater insult than shaving off the whole beard would have been. Then, cutting off the lower half of the garments exposes a man's parts which God had instructed should not be exposed. This offense was more easily remedied by getting new garments as soon as they left Ammon. These two offenses were an unusually humiliating punishment. Why cut off half the beard and not the whole beard? Why cut off half the garments and not the whole garment? The sage Abarbanel offers a rationale based on the premise that Hanun believed that although David's servants came to pay a genuine condolence call, they also came to spy. Because the king felt the men had good intentions as well as evil ones, he did not summarily execute them as he would have done if he were convinced they were spies. Instead, he applied a bizarre form of Solomonic wisdom and shaved off half of their beards and cut half of their flowing ministerial robes, administering a half punishment. When David heard about what was done to his ambassadors, he sent word to the ambassadors with instructions to ameliorate their humiliation. 2 Samuel 10:5. When they told David, he sent to meet them because the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, "Wait at Jericho until your beards have grown and then return." David treated his servants with compassion. He probably sent clothing to cover their nakedness, and by having them wait in Jericho, they would not have to appear in public until the sign of their humiliation was gone. David's consideration of his servants may have alerted the Ammonites to how greatly they had insulted David and Israel. 2 Samuel 10:6. When the people of Ammon saw that they had made themselves repulsive to David, the people of Ammon sent and hired the Syrians of Beit Rehob and the Syrians of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and from the king of Maacah 1,000 men, and from Ishtob 12,000 men. The word repulsive is translated from the Hebrew word ba'ash, number 887, meaning to smell bad, to stink, to be offensive morally, or to be abhorred. The idea of smell being associated with actions is common in the Bible. For example, the Lord says that an offering brought in humble submission to God has a sweet aroma. Ammon's actions toward Israel were just the opposite. They were arrogant and overbearing. Their actions were deep insults against Israel. So the Ammonites began to prepare for Israel to attack them. Their fear of the Israelites was so great that they hired 33,000 soldiers from the Syrians. Israel, under the generalship of Joab and his brother Abishai, soundly defeated Ammon. First, the Syrians fled, and then the Ammonites retreated behind the walls of their city. 2 Samuel 10:14. When the people of Ammon saw that the Syrians were fleeing, they also fled before Abishai and entered the city. So Joab returned from the people of Ammon and went to Jerusalem. The Ammonites stayed behind the walls of their city, but the Syrians who fled regrouped, brought in more soldiers, and continued the war. The Syrian leader was Hadadezer, the leader that David was recorded as defeating in chapter 8. So we see that this event fills in the details of the earlier record of David defeating Hadadezer. The Syrian force was larger than the earlier combined forces of the Ammonites and Syrians, so David personally took command of the forces of Israel. 2 Samuel 10:17. When it was told David, he gathered all Israel, crossed over the Jordan, and came to Halam. And the Syrians set themselves in battle array against David and fought with him. David defeated Hadadezer and the other Syrian kings who supported him. Hadadezer accepted defeat and became a vassal nation to Israel. David's two acts of kindness described in these chapters had different results. In the first case, David's kindness to Mephibosheth resulted in peace between the house of Saul and the house of David. Mephibosheth was like a son in David's house. That peace will be disturbed later in David's reign, but at the time that David acted kindly to Mephibosheth, there was peace. In the second case, David returned kindness for the kindness he received. Although David's motive was good, Ammon rejected David's overtures of peace. Despite Ammon's reaction, David intended good. Ammon could have turned away from their hatred of Israel and become a friend. That they didn't do so is no reflection on David. Similarly, God's desire for every person and nation is that they do good and cease to do evil. He gives everyone many chances to receive his kindness and make peace with him. Paul tells us in Romans 5:1 that we have peace with God when we receive his ultimate act of kindness towards us by accepting that Yeshua paid the penalty for our sins. What then should we expect when we extend kindness towards others? It doesn't matter whether our kindness is accepted or rejected. What matters is that the reward for our kindness comes from God and not man. Yeshua said that every act of kindness done to others is an act of kindness towards him. I'm Brenda Cathcart for Moed Ministries International. Shalom and be blessed.